Have you ever picked up a book and found yourself so completely sucked in that you simply couldn't put it down? I want to talk about why that happens. For anyone who's new to the channel, my name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author and I like making YouTube videos about writing stuff. For me, the first book that I remember this feeling of just being so incredibly immersed was Battlefield Earth. It was one of the first big science fiction stories that I read, and if I'm honest, it's kind of a mess. In fact, it's pretty interesting looking back on books that I really loved as a kid or as a teen with the new lens I have since I write novels for a living. But Battlefield Earth particularly stands out because I loved it so much. It's this sprawling adventure of a guy who overcomes insurmountable odds, rallies what's left of humanity, and overthrows a tyrannical intergalactic alien civilization to establish humans as the new ruling class. Super realistic. Super realistic. Seriously, it's an insecure teenager's fever dream. But if I'm honest, I recently picked it up again and I couldn't even get through the first few chapters. So in hoping to understand why it is that books sometimes suck us in and other times don't, I want to examine the experience that I had in both of these cases. See, we all come into books with our own expectations. I'm a huge proponent of the idea that a reader is the one who does the majority of the world building, is the one who does the majority of the storytelling, is the one who is bringing their own experience and their own lens, their own perspective to the story that they're reading. And as a writer, it doesn't matter what I intended with the story. What matters is what is communicated. And what is communicated is mostly based on the lens through which the person receiving the information understands the world. When I was young, I wanted a couple of different things. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to make sense of the world. I wanted to have a good understanding of who I was. And Battlefield Earth promised to take me on a journey to discover these things. It promised to speak to those core issues that I cared so deeply about. Whether it did it explicitly or implicitly, it doesn't matter. It's a fun adventure book, but watching the main character go on this journey to figure out who he was, to make sense of the world that he lived in, and to determine where he fit into it, was something that mirrored my own journey at that time in my life. And the fact that it did so in sort of a juvenile way actually fit perfectly, because at the time, that's sort of how I thought. Now, Kafka's Metamorphosis is a story that takes the reader on a similar journey. It tries to make sense of the world. It tries to determine how the main character fits into that world. It talks about understanding the sense of self. But there was no way in reading Metamorphosis that I would have been able to relate to that, because those thoughts were simply too deep for me. Battlefield Earth, on the other hand, was perfect. I could understand myself and the journey that I was on through examining the journey that the main character in Battlefield Earth is on. But when I came back to it, within the first few pages, I all of a sudden realized I wasn't trying to answer those questions anymore. I found that my desires had changed. My expectations had changed. The questions that I was trying to answer had changed. I know where I fit in. I've made sense of the world and all of the different confusing pieces of it. I know who I am, and I don't need to go on a quest to find myself anymore. I don't have those same burning questions. Instead, I have different burning questions. Will this provide rejuvenation for my mind? Is it a good way for me to rest and relax? Will this story be emotionally gripping? Am I going to get something for my investment into it? Will it help me learn something? Will I be able to improve my craft? And it became very apparent in the first few chapters of Battlefield Earth that that's not what the book was about, that it wasn't going to answer those questions. It wasn't going to address the burning questions of my soul as a reader, because the questions it was answering were different. They were about identity and place and about the world. And those just aren't the questions that I'm currently interested in. And that's okay. Not every book is for every person at all times. In fact, there may come a day when my identity does need to be re-explored, when I need to understand the world better, when I need to figure out how I fit into it. And maybe Battlefield Earth will be a good book for me again. But right now it's not. And so I put it down. When we write, we want to understand those two different experiences. We want to understand that when a person picks up a book to read, there is a question burning in their soul. And if you can address that question, you don't have to answer it, but if you can address it with the story that you're telling, they are going to be immersed. So at this point, some of you are probably saying, Seth, how does that help me at all as a writer? How do I figure out the perfect question to ask that is going to get everybody to love my book? Well, you can't. Because again, different people are going to come to your book with different expectations, with different questions burning in their soul. But you don't have to. All you have to do is pick a question to answer, maybe a couple of questions, and then make sure that your story is actually answering those questions. If you want people to read your books and absolutely love them, then you have to make sure you are not just listing a series of things. You are not simply recounting the facts of what happened. Instead, what you really want to do is you want to understand the underlying core burning question that you are trying to answer with your story, that your protagonist is experiencing as they progress through the events in the plot. And when you can do that, when you can identify what that question is, when you can understand where you are taking your protagonist and by extension the reader, you can really start to dive into the nuances of those questions. You can really start to dive into the answers that are going to keep people reading your book. And it doesn't have to be incredibly deep and profound. It doesn't matter if you're writing science fiction or fantasy or romance or Western. You can do this with any genre because stories at their core are about humanity. Stories at their core are about how people tick. And conveniently, your readers are human as well. And so they have those same questions, those same desires, those same ways of viewing the world. Just make sure that you're sticking to it. Because if you do, you'll find readers who won't put your book down even if their house is on fire.